Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, Doc.
Okay, so we're at the top of 12A, but let's just back up a little bit to to 11B. The most recent, or the last testimony of Ula, who quoted Rebbe Lazar. It's about 8 lines up from the bottom of 11B. We'll just do a quick review. Amar Rebbe Lazar, Hilchasa Govin Minhava. You can collect a debt if the debtor has no cash, but well, even if he does, but if he has slaves, you can collect them by taking possession of the slave. He asked me, does that mean even from an estate, from orphans? Well, I mean, no, only from the person himself. So yeah, so what do you have to tell us? You could collect, that you can collect any property if you have a debt that needs to be repaid, you can take the shirt off the guy's back. Well, what's the Chiddush in telling me that you can collect his slaves? We're talking about where the slave was made collateral for this particular loan. If you make your slave collateral for a loan and then you sell the slave to somebody else, so that somebody else is out of luck because the slave is designated collateral for the loan, the creditor can collect even from the third party after the sale. But if you make an ox your collateral, and you sell it, then it's out of reach of the creditor. If the sale is a valid sale, my time, what's the difference? In the case of selling a slave, as we will see, this is similar to when you sell in real estate. There is a call. There is people know about it. So the guy who bought the slave should have known better. Like he must have known when he bought the slave is collateral for the loan, and he's taking his chances. Okay. Well, after Rav Nachman left, Amar Lahu said to everybody, Hachi Amar Rav Lazar. Actually, this is what Rav Lazar says. If you let me ask me, you know what? I take it back. You can even collect from the estate. Amar Rav Nachman. When Rav Nachman heard about this, he said, "Ishtamti Ula." Ula was like trying to get away from me, trying to evade me. He didn't want to say this when I was there because he knows I hold a different opinion that a slave is like the ox, is like other movable property that cannot be collected from an estate. There was an actual case in Naharda. And there was a case where a slave was part of an estate, and there was a debt that needed to be paid by the estate. So the court there used this slave for to repay the debt. And there was also a case in Pumbedisa, Vagler of Chana Barbizna, where Chana Barbizna took the same action. Rav Nachman said about the Zilu Aduru. No, this is not right. You have to return them because he holds that you cannot, that slaves do not get paid from an estate, or if they're not used from an estate to pay back a debt. Below, and if you don't reverse the ruling, I'm going to go to you, the judges. I'm going to confiscate your homes, your property, and use that to pay back the debt, to pay back the orphans, because you incorrectly used their slave to pay back this debt. So I'm going to make it up to them with your property, or at least threatening them. I'm going to remember of that. So Rabbi says to Rav Ha'ula, Rabbi Lazar, Hadayin Dinarda, Rav Chana Bar Bizna. Like all these people are lining up against you. We have Ula's opinion, who quoted Rabbi Lazar. We have this case in Narda. We have this case in Pumbedisa. Everybody says that slaves are like land, cannot be collected from an estate, and you're saying yes, they can. Like, what's a mark like what's your support? You're against everybody else. Amalei said, I know a mission about this. Tanya Pavime taught in this brisa, Prusbul Hol Karka. So a prosbul, as you'll recall, is a way to um, during the Shemitah year, in the seventh year, you're supposed to forgive all debts. But the way to avoid that, the Hillel created this institution called prosbul, where basically you give over the ownership of your debts to the court, and the court is not subject to the rules of Shemitah, and so it's like a legal loophole. So he says the prosbul also takes effect on debts that have collateral of land, but not debts that have collateral of slaves. So also in the rules of Kinyan, of taking ownership of something, if you have a group of things that you want to take ownership of, and you take ownership of one of them, the whole group can be included. But so this Bryce is saying that movable objects can be included when you take possession of land, but not as you can't make a group, or you can't use the kinyan of a slave to also include the kinyan of metalslin. So from both of these rulings, we see that slaves are have different rules than land, and they have the rules of metalslin, of movable objects. So this is Rav Nachman's support that the same way when it comes to collecting a debt from an estate, that slaves should be treated um, like land, and they can't be confiscated, they can't be used. So, okay, so Lema cut tonight. So maybe this dispute is a dispute of tonight. Here we have here's another brisa. Person buys slaves and land in the same transaction. So if you take possession of a slave, that does not include the land. And if you take possession of the land, it doesn't include the slave. If you're buying land and movable object, if you take possession of the land, then you can include the movable object. But not the other way around. Now, what about slaves and so far we've seen that slaves are different than land. I'm sorry, slaves are like land and not like metalslin, not like movable objects. And then the last case of this brisa, if you buy slaves and movable objects, if you take possession of the slaves, that does not include the rest of the objects. And if you take possession of other objects, it doesn't include the slaves. This brisa seems to hold that slaves are like movable objects. Okay, they can be included with land, but not the other way around, just like movable objects. But we have another brisa. As we said, we're trying to set this up as a contradict. There's an argument between two different Mishnaic sources. Another brisa, if you take possession of the slaves, you can include the movable objects. So that implies that slaves are like land, right? So that seems to be the point of distinction between these two brisas. Isn't this the argument? One source holds that slaves are like movable objects, and one source holds that slaves are like land. And that would so Amravika Bereder of Ravami, Ravika said, now you can say that everybody thinks that slaves are like real estate. So why did one brisa say that you can buy slaves, and along with that you can acquire the movable objects, shapir? So that makes sense. But the other source that says you can't use the acquisition of slaves you cannot use the acquisition of slaves to also acquire the movable objects. Why would that be? If it's like karka, if it's like real estate that does work. So why would that? Why does that Bryce say it doesn't work? V'hadanya lo kana, be'inan karka dumya de'arim mitsuros bihuda. Okay, so really slaves are like land, but when it comes to the Kenyan, when it comes to this kind of group acquisition, it's a certain type of land that has to be used if you want to acquire um, the movable objects at the same time. And and that is based on this verse about um, Arimatsuros Yehuda, fortified cities in Yehuda. It's a long idea. Um, so so with regard to everything else, slaves can be considered like land, but when it comes to a group Kenyan, there are different rules. Okay, and even though slaves are generally considered like land, and so in the case of the debtor estate, the slaves and land could be considered the same. With regard to group Kenyan, they're not the same. Um, because because land like fortified land in Yehuda, like towers or whatever, buildings you can't move, and only things that you can't move um, are can be used in a group kingdom, which excludes slaves, which do just none. And what's the like? Why do we make that claim? It's not because we have a Mishnah. The chasim she'en lehem achrayus, movable property. Niknin chasim she'esh lehem achrayus can be acquired as part of a group with real property. But kesef, b'shar, v'chazaka. There's three ways to do that: by money, by a contract, and by a chazaka who transfers a proprietary act. Okay, in other words, you kind of demonstrate your ownership of it. How do we know that? Chizkiah says because we have a verse by Yitain Lahem Aviyam Matanos Rabos Lekasef Ulazav Ulmigdanosim Arim Tsuras V'Yehuda. This verse that we just quoted, their father gave them gold, silver, and treats, along with these fortified cities. So here we have a depiction of a group of things that are being acquired. The gold and the silver, etc., together with these cities in Yehuda. So that's the source for the idea that the only way you can affect this group acquisition is through actual cities, things that actual land that can't be moved. That is real estate, and not so that implies not including slaves, which even though they have aspects like real estate, they can walk around. They're not like land in that sense, and so they're not eligible for this group acquisition. Ikadiyam, right? There's another way to that this was read. Now we're going to look at it the other way around. Maybe both of these Bryces hold that slaves are like movable objects, not like real estate. So it makes sense to say that you can't acquire them in a group. But the other brisa that says that you can use the acquisition of a slave to also acquire the other things in the group. But that's if the thing is in the slave's pocket, right? If he's carrying around, the other thing that you want to include in the group, and you acquire the slave, then you acquire the things that he is carrying. That's what that Mishnah means. So that's an exceptional case, a specific case in which that works. But you don't want my habit. So of course says, well, so what? So it's in his pocket. Like, so what? So usually we have a rule that if you can acquire something that's put in your property, right? That's a valid way to acquire something that's sitting in your property, but not if your property is moving, is walking around. The slave is considered a chatzer, a property that's walking around. And that does not acquire something. Maybe you say the slave is not walking around, he's actually standing still. Rama says that doesn't matter. He has the potential to be walking around, so he's considered a movable yard. Even if he's standing still, not moving, he's still considered a movable yard, and so he should not be able to you should not be able to include the things that he's carrying around in the group acquisition. The Hilchasa, the Gemara says, you know how we can explain this, the kafus. It's when the slave is tied up. Okay, so he's a chatzer. He can't move because he's tied up. Therefore, so that is the only way in which you can use the slave to affect the acquisition of things that are in his pockets if he's tied up and can't move. And then he's considered like a chatzer that can also, like real estate, that can also acquire the other things. But now we have a third source. If you make a kinyan, you acquire the real estate, then that you can also acquire the slaves as part of this group. So doesn't that contradict the first brisa that says that's not the case, right? So we have a contradictory source. So Hasabam de Basocha, that case is talking about where the slaves are in the field, so you acquire the land. You acquire the land, and the slave is standing on the land. That's how you can acquire the slave. But if they're in separate places, then the group thing doesn't work. And that, according to that first reason. So now remember we had two ways of looking at what Ravika said. We called the high low kana to the first brisa where he has not, it doesn't work to acquire the slaves. So we're talking about the case where he's not standing in the field. The slave is not standing in the field. That's why it doesn't work. So the first version of what we read about Ravika, that makes sense. Because if they're standing in the field, it works, and if they're not standing in the field, it doesn't work. But the second version of Ravika, where the assumption was that slaves are like land, are like real estate. What's the difference if they're standing in the field or not, right? If you have 10 fields in one transaction and they're in 10 different countries, you can do a group acquisition. Once you do the proper acquisition of the first field, then all the fields in the contract are considered are considered part of that acquisition. So, how do you explain this second version of Rabbi? Because like Mark turns around and says, okay, so smart guy. According to the version that says that slaves are like metaltalin, are like movable objects, what's the difference if you're standing in the field, right? Like we know that why should it matter if you're standing in the field? If you're going to allow this group, we know that you don't need them to be physically together. The group doesn't need to be physically together. So what are you going to say? That you have to distinguish between animated metaltalin, things that can move themselves, like an ox, let's say, is something that can walk, even though it's considered metaltalin. Not even though, but specifically, like you have to distinguish between things that can move. Okay, so slaves have to be standing in the field since they can move, since they can walk, but the other but inanimate objects, they actually have to be in the field. So also in the version of Ravika that we're discussing, so land land quote that can walk, that can move, is different than land that can't move, right? Land that can move would be the slave. So when Shmuel said that a bunch of different fields can be acquired at the same time by acquiring one of them, that doesn't work for slaves. Avda Karke Denainahu, because slaves are not fields. They can walk. And Hasam Sadna Diarachatu. And in Shmuel's case, the whole like the whole globe is one piece of land, right? So uh, like it makes sense to say that that you can acquire all these different pieces of land in different places. They can all be acquired together. They're all part of the same earth, right? So so slaves having to be standing in the field to be acquired can be understood either way. So that's kind of a rather kind of complex digression to get to where we knew we were going to get in the first place, um, which is that uh, the idea that the slaves have to be standing in the field to be part of the group can be is what Ravika was getting. Okay, so that is the end of this series of statements by unless I forget already. Ula in the name of Rabbi. And now we're going back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, "Nechasim she'en behen meila." When we say that you're liable for damages that your ox causes or whatever, uh, these rules of liability only apply to items that are not subject to meila. Now, meila, we're getting into things regarding kachim, right? Sanctified objects. In most cases, we'll see some exceptions or some distinctions. The general idea is that if you damage something that belongs to kachim, that belongs to God, as it were, it's the property of the temple that's been sanctified, then you are subject to to a penalty, basically, for damaging them, or for stealing them, or what have you, for using them. Okay, so since the Mishnah mentioned things that are subject to mi'ila, to this penalty, so the Gemara is pointing out that, you know what, there are things that are sanctified, but are not subject to mi'ila. So those things would be included in the usual rules of damages. And what are those things? Montana. What is that about? Those are, Rabbi Yochanan says these are kachim kalim. So there's two categories of kachim, of sanctified things. Most sanctified things, sacrifices are called kachim, and they have specific rules about how they're sacrificed and where, and who can eat them or not eat them, and do they get burned, etc., etc. That's like most sacrifices, like the hatas, and asham, and ola, right? But there are things like the shlamim, which is kind of a shared sacrifice where the owner eats some, the kohanim eats some gets burned on the altar, and those have different rules about where they are slaughtered and so on. So kachim kalim, Rabbi Yossi Aglili says that those are actually the property of the owners. Tanya, what's the source for that? We have a brayso umal amal nashem. So the Torah talks about if you take an oath regarding property of property that's sanctified, and then these are the consequences. You have to pay the penalty, etc. So that includes kachim kalim in this rule of being punished for taking false oaths, because they're still the property of the owner. So that's Rabbi Yossi's response. But then we have another Mishnah. What if you use your part of kachim kalim, right? You bring us carbon shlamim, part of it is given to you to eat, and you use that as kiddushin to marry a woman. Ben b'kachim kalim, whether it's doesn't work, right? Even if it's kachim kalim and it's yours, so clearly it's not your property according to this. Lame of the local Rabbi Yossi Aglili. So does that oppose Rabbi Yossi Aglili? Or it says no, if you look at Rabbi Yossi Aglili, you could reconcile that view. Yamar Rabbi Yossi Aglili mechaim. Rabbi Yossi Aglili says this is before the slaughtering of the animal. That's when it's still considered your property. The property was kachim. After it's been slaughtered, and that's the case was on Kaddish Bechalko. It's your portion of it, so it must be after the sacrifice has been sacrificed, and you're given part of it to eat. So after the slaughtering, once you've begun the sacrifice process itself, it's not your property anymore. Sure, you get to eat it, but it's like you're eating at God's table. It's the property of Kachim, property of the temple, but you are given the privilege of eating it. That doesn't make it yours. So the Gemara says, is that really what he said? But it's not. Bechor mochrin also tam chai. A bechor, a firstborn animal, can be sold by the Kohen if it's still unblemished, while it's still alive, before it's slaughtered. But if it is blemished, I mean, it's not eligible anymore for the korban, or if it's already been slaughtered. Oh yeah, so that's also, it can still be sold by the Kohen. And he can use it to marry a woman. Nachman said, that's only in the present time. Since there's no temple and there's no sacrifice being done, so the Kohanim then retain some ownership in it. But in the time of the temple, the Chazil Akrava, where it could be actually sacrificed, low. Then the Kohen can't use it. It's not his property, and the Kohen doesn't have any rights in it. Rava was Nachman, and Rava asked about that. What about the pasuk we just quoted? By swearing against falsely about this consecrated about an object, about a consecrated object, you commit mi'ila. Rabos kachim kalim shehin mamono. That comes to include kachim kalim, which are your property, and the bechor is your property. You were Yosef Lili, and the bechor is one of these kachim kalim. So Mishatne Ravina answered that. Bechor b'chutz la'aretz. We're talking about outside of Eretz Yisrael. If you have a bechor, a firstborn animal that came from outside of Israel, that came in as it doesn't have any blemishes, then they can be sacrificed. They can be proper bechor. They can be sacrificed on the mizbeach. So that implies that if they came to Eretz Yisrael, then yes, then you can use them as sacrifices. But like it sounds like it's only if they happen to come to Israel, not that you're required to send them to Israel to be sacrificed. So doesn't that imply that it is the property of the Kohen, right? Because if it were not his property, if it were really belonging to the mizbeach, to the temple, then you'd be required to send it. So the fact that it seems to be only optional implies that it is the Kohen's property. V'imisa. So if it's true, we said before, the Chiyam Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Mamono Mekayim, Rabbi Yossi Aglili says that until the V'chor is slaughtered, or the Kachim Kalim are slaughtered, they belong to the owner. Lisha. So Ravina can ask as follows: How Rabbi Yossi Aglili Harabanan? Like, you don't have to reconcile everything. Rabbi Yossi Aglili holds that way, and the rabbis hold differently. So my answer is, wait a minute. You're trying to bring a proof. You're trying to tell me about ownership of Kachim Kalim, and you're talking about about who owns it, whether the Kohen owns the gifts that are given to him. No, it's not like that. In the case of someone who makes a donation, designates a sacrifice, so we could say that's his until it's slaughtered. It's not the same as Matnos Kahuna, where we say that why do the Kohanim get the rights to this? It's not because they're given ownership of it. It's because it's owned by God, as it were. It's owned by the temple, and the Kohanim are given the privilege of eating it. But it doesn't mean that they have ownership. So don't try to tell me from the case of the Kohen, who the ownership of Kachim Kalim, we can still say that Kachim Kalim are owned by the owner before they're slaughtered. And we will stop here, and David will pick it up tomorrow. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you, Dov. Have a good day.